go ahead. Welcome everyone to part 2 of the future of internet freedom. Today we're going to discuss policies and priorities for the new administration. You can see on this particular page our generous co-sponsors from the American University, the Internet Society, and the Voices of Internet Freedom Coalition. And we want to thank them for their support and dedication to internet freedom. So let's go ahead and take that down. Thanks again, everyone. In December of last year, we held our first event, and at that time, we decided to look at the demand side of internet freedom. So we had represented the voices of activists, human rights workers, journalists, and others. And then on the technology side, we looked at how many people in the world actually use anti-censorship tools and what the demand is. Well, that situation certainly hasn't changed. If we look just recently in the headlines about the military coup in Myanmar, my friends in the anti-censorship communities tell me that internet usage, barring the 2 interruptions that we had, that the government invoked, are at least 2 orders of magnitude greater than they were before. So there is no let up in demand. But what we're going to do today here is talk about supply. And by supply, we mean where does the money come from to fund internet freedom, and who is doing it, and how our priorities set, and whether we have the right strategic focus or not. So I'm going to just briefly discuss where the supply situation is, and then I will introduce our panelists, and we'll go ahead and start the dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And the first thing I'd like to look at is the, at least from the United States standpoint, the background on internet freedom. I count that there have been 8 congressional resolutions beginning in 2009 that have indicated a strong bipartisan support for a free and open internet, including this famous Senate resolution from the 111th Congress. These resolutions pass with no opposition virtually. And the policy of supporting internet freedom around the world has also been matched with spending on internet freedom programs as well. Many of these resolutions were specific to certain countries. Others were in support of global internet freedom. So what we have in the US today is, at least up until now, a strong bipartisan support for freedom on the net. If I now look at the numbers, I went back to the budget bills from 2016 up through the latest budget bill, which was passed and signed by the president former president, on December 27th. And using 2016 as a base year, the overall top line funding in the federal budget for internet freedom programs has risen by 22%. So that percent change indicates again that Congress has seen the value of these programs and continues to raise its levels of funding. So in 2021, we have the highest top line ever at $70 million. Now then, if I look at where the money actually goes, this is a rather intricate process, and I'm not going to go into all of these numbers. However, There are 6 major areas in which internet freedom programs are operating in. This does not include some technical projects in the National Science Foundation or DARPA. It doesn't include USAID's information and communications technologies for development, or for the Global Engagement Center and other agencies that deal with other forms of democracy promotion, rule of law, and countering disinformation. Nevertheless, these 6 areas include priority regions. In the 2021 budget, for example, there are specific allocations for Eastern Europe and for Asia. There is support for anti-censorship or circumvention tools and techniques, both existing techniques and new technologies. We'll hear a little bit more today about the digital security side of internet freedom, because in addition to providing access, we also have to make arrangements and develop tools and techniques to protect activists, journalists, and others who are communicating from repressive environments. We heard a lot about that last December. There's direct support for certain circumvention tools. This is particularly true with agencies like USAGM that support their own broadcasting and content creation and need to support tools that will deliver that content across the world. And then 2 other areas, policy and advocacy. Certainly infrastructure, human infrastructure that builds support for civil society organizations in the area of internet governance, human rights, and rule of law are very important. And then a certain amount of applied research to try and catalog where things stand, what the state of internet freedom is in the world, and the specific laws and regulations that are operating today. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our panel. And if you would like to just start your video and give us a wave, I'd like to begin by introducing the Dean of the Engineering School at Purdue University and our former Science and Technology Advisor for the U.S. Secretary of State, Dr. Mung Chiang. Dr. Chiang, it's really a pleasure to have you here today. I know that you are a champion of internet freedom, and to prove that, as a professor, I'm just going to give everyone in the room here a reading assignment. And I'd like them to read The Networked Life and The Power of Networks, which are 2 excellent books. They answer all kinds of questions that we have, and they're fun to read and very informative and very insightful. So please do look them up. Second, I'd like to introduce Clara Sao. Hello, Clara. Glad you could make it. You are appearing from the West Coast, is that right? Okay, great. Clara is president of the board of the White House Presidential Innovation Fellows Foundation, and she is the former chief technology officer of the Department of Homeland Security. So I'm sure she's going to have a lot to say about the issues in front of us today. Next, we have my longstanding friend and colleague, MAZIAR Bahari, who is coming to us from London. MAZIAR is an award-winning film producer and president of Journalism for Change. If you have ever seen the film about Iran called Rosewater, MAZIAR is the producer, and I'm not sure if you were the director, but producer behind the award-winning film Rosewater. Next, we have Harlow Homes. Harlow, Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. Harlow is Director of Digital Security at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And you are on the front lines of internet freedom and protecting journalists. So we're really happy to have you here and hope to hear more about that side of the problem. And then Mallory Nodal. Mallory, we have another Chief Technology Officer with us today. She is the CTO for the Center for Democracy and Technology. She's done quite a bit of work with the Internet Research Task Force on Human Rights. Fortunately, there is no CTD event today, which is why we picked February 11th, Mallory, because your events are so numerous and so popular that we can't possibly compete with it, but keep up the good work there. And then finally, I'd like to welcome Sarah Macon. Sarah, in her most recent two jobs, was the former Deputy Assistant to the President, and she had a very demanding and responsible position as Senior Director for Strategic Engagement at the National Security Council. I know Sarah's done a lot of work in international religious freedom, and we'd like to hear a lot more about the strategy and priorities and policies. Well, looking at that $70 million top line, one would have the impression that all is well and good in the world of internet freedom, that we have plenty of money. I might ask some of the panelists at some point, or Aram, you can chime in as well. Aram Sinnreich is going to be our discussion leader for today and my close colleague at American University. But if you had $70 million to spend, Aram, I might ask you where you might spend it at some point in today's discussion. But to start us off, I'd like to hear from Dr. Chiang, because he's probably had the greatest span of control over internet freedom programs in his role as the Secretary of State Science Advisor. And we'd like to get your views on kind of where things stand, where we have been, and where we are headed. So, Dr. Chiang, please.
Thank you very much, Eric. Mic check, see if you can hear me. Great, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this panel. I want to thank American University, a voice of internet freedom and internet society, for organizing part two of this very important conversation. And Eric, I think you might have overestimated my influential power and ability over anything budget related. But I would certainly love to start a bit of a conversation around the guardrails and the pillars of digital freedom. And certainly in my mind that a fundamental premise for tech diplomacy for the United States is that technology must advance freedom. And in this century and beyond, digital freedom is the primary manifestation, the primary form in which freedom resides. And I want to first spend a couple of minutes to describe what I think as the four guardrails, principles of digital freedom. What I call the transparency, minimalism, optionality, and recourse. That whether we're talking about an AI system or communication system, such as the internet, first and foremost is transparency of the policies by the companies involved, by the government to the end users. And second is that it should be a minimalistic approach, just like if somebody at the restaurants want to know whether alcohol can be served to you, all that we need to know is a binary answer: are you above age 21 or not? Certainly, at least in this country, that is the binary question. I don't need to know your birthday. I don't need to know your social security number to answer that question. Thirdly is optionality, that in addition to being transparent and minimalist, you should also be given as an end user a chance to opt out and never be assumed to be automatically opt in. And finally, recourse. I think this is the sharpest contrast between the nightmarish Orwellian vision of 1984 and what we would like to see from technology. And that is when an end user feels that her rights to transparency, minimalism, and optionality are under threat or damaged, then she has a recourse through an independent judiciary and a fair judicial system with rule of law to appeal and litigate against the companies and the government. Now, internet freedom, I think, is part of digital freedom. And there are generally three attacks that's happening to internet freedom. One is censorship and blockage. Two is propaganda. And three is surveillance. So the first two work hand in hand with each other. One is to take away your ability to get what you want. And the other is to force feed you what they would like to read and see. And then the third one is just surveilling you, usually without any of digital freedom principles. So let me maybe spend the last 2 minutes of my opening remarks to talk a bit about what we can do for each of those three. I'll come back to the censorship in just a minute, but I think on the propaganda front, the best way to defeat bad arguments is to allow better arguments to have a platform to be voiced, rather than to censor or silence and suppress any arguments. And then as to the surveillance, I think we very much need research on anti-big data. We hear a lot of funding and progress in big data using machine learning. Perhaps it is time to do protection using anti-big data technology and research. As to the censorship part, which is the primary focus of this panel, there are two dimensions. One is what do we do with blockage? And there is a lot of exciting work going on using a combination of broadcast, whether it is shortwave radio or new satellite technologies, together with on-the-ground peer-to-peer solutions. This broadcast plus peer-to-peer is a very promising technology direction. As to the typical censorship without shutting down the entire internet with a kill switch, I think the two primary principles behind many technologies, one is hopping, the other is collateral cost. You would like to hop very fast along some dimensions and then try to hide behind a haystack so that in order to block the needle, some very useful haystacks must be blocked, thereby increasing the collateral cost for the censors. But at the end of the day, and I'll conclude my opening with this quick thought, and that is, you need a social fabric of trust often to go alongside technological advances. And that's why we see some of the most popular and heavily used anti-censorship tools available today in actual at-scale deployment and usage are often built and deployed by those who have this human fabric trust built into their system. With that, I turn it back to Eric. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much, Dr. Chiang. I hope that those four principles are remembered and enshrined as the internet freedom 3 laws of robotics at some point. So thanks again. I'd like now to turn to Harlow and ask her about the security side. We talk a lot about access and anti-censorship, but people also need to be protected in the context of human rights and journalists. And in your work to advance digital security, where are we and where do we need to go?
That's a very tall order to fill. And also thank you very much for having me on this panel with a lot of very interesting guests that I rarely get the opportunity to be in conversation with. But by way of introduction, I will just, yeah, kind of start out with it. I'm the director of digital security at Freedom of the Press Foundation, which is a US-based nonprofit 501c3 whose mandate is to work with journalists primarily in the public interest in telling the stories that the entire public desperately needs for them to tell. We are based in the US, but we work internationally. And also from a personal perspective, I've had the immense privilege of working with a lot of the technologies, the teams and institutions that you have worked with, that you've mentioned, and even go way further back than 2016, which was, you know, the that basis of that chart that you showed. A lot of these projects and programs actually got their funding, got their start in Washington and internationally way before that. So I do want everyone to appreciate that history, and I hope that we'll have that in more discussion during the course of this talk. But what Freedom of the Press Foundation does is, I would like to say threefold. We do three things, and I think we do them very well. One is my department, which is the Digital Security Training Department. We perform a lot of trainings, consultancies, and we also have a digital security auditing practice, a program that we've built from the ground up. And we work primarily with journalists and documentarians from enterprise level down to freelancers. We work with a lot of umbrella institutions and form alliances with them, such as like the International Women's Media Foundation, the Sundance Documentary Institute. So it spans the gamut, and we love doing this work. Another thing that we do is technology building. So we have a team of engineers that have spearheaded, among a number of things, but like our flagship product is something called Secure Drop. Secure Drop is a newsroom appliance that connects journalists within newsrooms to the public at large when they are willing and able to become whistleblowers, to connect them via the Tor network and a number of other technologies that we have like bundled into it, in order to ensure from at least a technological perspective that they can actually have that confidential communication. And we are very proud to have not only created a really like effective platform for newsrooms to use. I'm not going to, we don't have any insight into how newsrooms use Secure Drop by design. And it's only when people tell us that, you know, we were impactful in getting these stories published, but we have a running tab of numerous stories that have actually changed the course of, you know, like contemporary history, just due to the fact that we were able to connect people. We also have an advocacy team that is very active, including our own little newsroom called the US Press Freedom Tracker, that documents incidents where members of the press have had their rights trampled upon. And this project started in 2017, maybe 18, sorry, don't quote me on that. But when it started, we were looking at like a different relationship with between members of the press and, you know, like the law enforcement, the public at large, you know, whatever that journalists ultimately face. But these infractions on press freedom within the United States have ramped up considerably over the past maybe 2 years. I'm not going to go into details here, but if you do want to look at the US Press Freedom Tracker, you would be amazed to see exactly how much members of the press have been challenged in doing their job. And I'm sure from all of our perspectives at our various posts, we've seen that similarly. But one thing that I do want to spotlight, and that creates a thread between all of these different sources, is our reliance on open source. So that goes from like a various, you know, like different perspectives. Like one, of course, Secure Drop is open source, and actually as it's open source, that allows us to perform the role that we do as, you know, like people who will help you get Secure Drop up and running, people will help train your staff on how to use it, people who will even help, you know, like discuss with you how to approach investigations. when you need it, because we actually have no insight into what your secure drop contains, and we're okay with that. And actually, fun anecdote, whenever somebody calls me up and they say like, oh, like, Harlow, I really want to work on this story, and like, I'm like, stop, I don't actually care. I want to read about it when it comes out. Just tell me about your tech problems. But also, we've done stuff like open sourcing the rest of it. We have a project called Secure the News, which is a fork of another project that came out of 18F, which is a great organization in DC, centered in the US government for building technology projects, that actually rates newsrooms on how open they are, as far as like the encryption that they provide and the protection to their visitors, their newsroom visitors, the everyday public is concerned. We also recently open sourced the US Press Freedom Tracker. So any jurisdiction, not just in the United States, but other countries can take that same methodology and build their own site in order to continue to report on what they're seeing locally. And in addition to like open sourcing the code, which is incredibly important, we also open source the data because that's where credibility comes from. What's really cool, I have to actually give commendations to our web development team, is that the US Press Freedom Tracker was designed from the very beginning with an API at its core. So if ever any person who is researching this period of history that we're currently living in, they can actually use that API not only to absorb the data as narrative, but to absorb the data as quantitative data. And so these are fundamentals that are incredibly important to me. Finally, I will say that, like, we have, once again, as not only a member of Freedom of the Press Foundation, but as a member of this broader community, I have had the immense privilege to work with so many other organizations. And we've also learned a lot of lessons coming to a criteria of evaluating what we do, or the projects that come out of our community and how we should promote them. And from a trainer's perspective, that's incredibly important because as a trainer, when I am going into, like a certain situation, when I have to make recommendations about what a particular investigative unit should use, how you should communicate with the source, how you should get this data across several borders, etc. All of these recommendations that I make are not based on the tools themselves, but they're based off of certain criteria, and that is openness, honesty, and ultimately, like, its fundamental commitment to advancing a free press. I mean, in addition to the technology behind it, its cryptographic ability to ensure confidentiality. There's so many other factors, and so this is why I'm very proud to be like a member of this broader community with its commitment to a holistic and overreaching commitment to all of these separate factors that a lot of people, when they're just tool building, never actually think about. Really like love to be in dialogue, and even from the previous introduction, there's a lot to kind of absorb, and I would love to talk to you about. And that's it. Thank you for having me.
Very good. Thank you, Harlow. We also welcome your contributions to this community because they're truly outstanding. I'd like to turn now to MAZIAR. And today is the 42nd anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. MAZIAR wrote a great piece in IranWire about that event. Maybe he can tell us a little bit about what's happening in the country right now. But as a content producer, it would be interesting to know about the availability of how we deliver independent news and information, and the challenges of creating it digitally and then allowing your listeners, viewers, and audience to obtain that information and act on it. MAZIAR?
Well, thank you so much, Eric. Can you hear me? Is my microphone on? I can't see myself. Is my microphone on?
We can see and hear you, Maziar.
You can see and hear me. Okay, thank you so much. I couldn't see. Thank you so much for organizing this event. And thanks everyone for participating. So yesterday was the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. And to me, this is very symbolic because what internet freedom means to me is controlling the narrative. And the way that Ayatollah Khomeini managed to lead the Islamic Revolution 42 years ago was through controlling the narrative. He managed to control the narrative, take the narrative away from the Shah, mobilize the mosques, mobilize the masses through audio cassettes. I'm not sure how many of the members of the audience remember the audio cassettes, the little things that we used to record things, and so those were his that was his medium. He used to record his messages to his followers in his house in Iraq in exile and send the cassettes into Iran. And sometimes his messages were written by his followers and they were Xeroxed and photocopied and they were spread around the country. 42 years later, we are still fighting for controlling the narrative by the Islamic government in Iran, as well as the people of Iran, as well as the opposition. So as Eric mentioned, I'm the president of Journalism for Change, and one of the main projects that we have is IranWire, which is a website that it's in iranwire.com, which is a website which is in Persian, English, Azerbaijani, and several other languages. And we are the beneficiaries of internet freedom. What we are trying to do, we are trying to find the little gaps here and there when they are available inside Iran in order to somehow affect the narrative in Iran. And not creating our own narrative, but by allowing Iranian audiences to share their information, gather information, disseminate information, and sometimes, in some cases, be able to coordinate their efforts in order to make the government more accountable. So what we have witnessed in the past decade or so, since let's say 2009, when the Green movement happened, was the Iranian government trying to control the narrative, not only through propaganda and through terrestrial television and satellite television, but also by narrowing the internet bandwidth, expanding it at some times, using filter busters. And it might be interesting for some of the panelists to know that the Iranian government is using Chinese technology in order to censor the internet. And on the other hand, the Iranian people, they are using Chinese filter busters like Freegate in order to crack through the censorship and access the information. So Iranians have been, in 2009, during the Green Movement, the Iranian, many millions of Iranians, they used the available internet platforms, especially at that time, Twitter and Facebook, which were new phenomena at that time, in order to share information, gather information, and mobilize themselves and came to the streets. And the government has realized that. So they have been trying in different ways in order to affect this mobilization by people. They have had agents that infiltrate different sites. They gather information on opposition members. We heard the news from an Israeli company the other day that the Iranian government gathers information on people through different apps. And sometimes they just do it the old-fashioned way, like they did it in November 2009 during the demonstrations, and they just shut down the internet in order to just stop the demonstrations and stop the people being able to mobilize themselves. So for me, when we are talking about internet freedom and how can different governments, how can different organizations help people, the best way to do it and I think the most effective way to be able to have any kind of change in Iran is to create technology like, or expand technologies like Starlink, Elon Musk's satellite internet technology, help different VPNs like Siphon and others. And that way, I think there will be a very peaceful change in Iran, because people will be able to have access to their information, be able to talk to themselves, be able to discuss ideas, and be able to share the information of what is going on inside the country with us and through us with the rest of the world, or directly through social media with the rest of the world. Because at the moment, what has happened in the absence of free flow of information in Iran, many people outside of the country, including some Iranians, they have a very distorted image of what is going on in Iran. They are, their decisions, sometimes they are affected by the echo chambers that exist outside of the country. And I think if the United States government wants to have a long-term change in Iran for the better, the best way, and I think the most efficient way, the cheapest way to do that is through investing in satellite internet technology and VPNs in order to allow people to talk to themselves, gather information, and disseminate information with themselves and with the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you very much, Maziar. Yes, there are some new technologies on the horizon, and maybe that will expand the horizons of internet freedom. We certainly hope so. I'd like to turn to Mallory and then to Sarah for our next set of remarks. Mallory, the United States should not do this alone. Where do we stand, given your experience with the Freedom Online Coalition and your other work? How do we enlist the support of like-minded countries, and where should the Biden administration be putting its emphasis on that score?
Thanks, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to talk about CDT's work and also my other affiliations that have put me into internet governance spaces, which tend to be have a really global and international focus. So at CDT, we really do two things. For those who aren't familiar, we really are good at tech-informed policy. So we've recently put out some priorities for the Biden administration around democracy and technology, which I can tweet out after this session. And then the other thing that I lead on is a vertical around technology and human rights. So really trying to get into the technical community and engineering focused spaces to have conversations about what's best in the public interest. How do we solve problems such as privacy while balancing other potentially conflicting issues? How do we solve censorship from a technical perspective? So the policy and tech are really joined together. And you're right that the US can't solve it alone. And on the other hand, it's something that was on the first slide that you shared, which is that internet freedom is a cornerstone of the US's foreign policy. It's now the way that the US has been influential and led on democratic values internationally by working with other democratic governments, such as those that are members of the Freedom Online Coalition, and built coalitions and funding pools around this. So one of the things that has come up before is issues around funding. And I think the US does offer the most funding for internet freedom projects, for alternative free and open source tools for activists, whistleblowers, and journalists to use. But we need more. And I think, CDT and several other NGOs recognize the need for that in the past year by signing a letter asking other democratic governments to step up. We know that Sweden also funds quite a bit, but we'd like to see more of, especially the Freedom Online Coalition governments, helping fill that gap, because we need a variety of sources to keep a lot of these existing and useful tools active and well maintained. In addition to the massive amount of resources that have to be spent in the multitude and proliferating internet governance mechanisms that are required to truly run an open internet with as many stakeholder input as possible. And then the last thing that was also mentioned by someone else was we need a lot more research, to be honest, to know exactly what are some of these gaps and trade-offs that we so carefully walk. And I would just say, out of the priorities that CDT laid out for the Biden administration, there are a few that I just wanted to highlight that I think the US can do domestically while also working internationally, but leading by example in some cases, and also the opposite, which is taking the lead from others who've done well. I mean, the first one is privacy legislation. I mean, that's just clear. We really need that in the United States, and we can take a page from some of our democratic partners abroad. It is really about minimalism in this case. We just need to limit collection, limit sharing, limit use of user data. And I would say that the US has an opportunity to craft privacy legislation that centers issues such as anti-discrimination. And we can, again, and try to correct racial justice. And that could really improve and iterate upon other privacy legislations that we see in many other countries and make it very, very strong. Another one is around things that have already been done by US administrations in the past, but need to continue. And that is to create guidance around procurement for federal, state, municipal governments of technology. It needs to set a really high bar for especially dual use technologies because of the risk of use for surveillance and other things. And then on that point around dual use technologies, guidance around export controls and things like that are really welcome in making sure that those are developed with as many stakeholders as possible to make sure that they're not overly aggressive. Next, I want to talk about a dual use technology that a lot of people like to talk about, which is encryption, end-to-end encryption in particular, which needs to be protected, needs to continue to be protected by the Biden administration, because we know that not just in the US, but abroad in other countries, Brazil, India, the UK, Australia, there are agencies that would really like to disrupt the technical ways in which end-to-end encryption works, and we just need that to be off the table, because we've not only seen the backdoor conversation come up over and over again for a couple decades, it's actually escalating. I think what law enforcement agencies are asking for now go well beyond what we considered to be a backdoor in the 90s, and I think we need to be really clear about that. Net neutrality would be really great to have once again. I think we have the benefit of trying again to bring back net neutrality, but also understanding the technical ways that ISPs are trying to improve efficiency. So we need to, I think there's a lot of research that can be done here, but looking at emerging technologies such as edge computing and network slicing and that sort of thing to really define what we think net neutrality is and how ISPs can abide by it best while still, delivering good services and filling the digital divide. So unpacking that tension with some solid policy would be super excellent. And just lastly, I'll just mention funding again, because I think restoring funding, increasing funding, leveraging relationships abroad to also find new sources of funding is incredibly important, because internet governance, like I mentioned before, is an ever increasing space. It isn't just that the internet and its governance is being talked about at, one UN body. It is now being talked at all of them. The Human Rights Council, the WTO, all of these agencies now have some stake in how the internet is governed. And that puts a huge strain on advocates like myself and other civil society members who we know are important to these conversations, because it means we have to be everywhere, and that's really difficult to do. So we need to think about funding for that and what we've set out to achieve, which is truly well-informed policy setting. And I think really that's it. I would just say that I'm looking forward to the US taking a lot more leadership, again, in bodies like the Freedom Online Coalition, because there's just, I think the internet, since it was founded, the FOC that is, it's also been 10 years and a lot has changed. And there's a lot more work than there used to be.
Very good. Thank you so much, Mallory. In addition to looking at what we can do with a lot more money, we also have to have a network of implementers who can make things happen. And one of the people who has had a tremendous amount of experience with that is Clara. And so Clara, if you had that $70 million, kind of what are the opportunities and what are the obstacles toward getting things done to advance the cause of internet freedom?
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, first off, for having me on this very esteemed panel. I wanted to share a little bit about my background and then jump into exactly this topic of what can we do to be more efficient with funding, because this is often a black box that makes it really hard for some of the most marginalized groups and voices to be able to effectively deploy solutions on the ground. So I had joined US government back in 2016, actually under the Obama administration, in a program called the White House Presidential Innovation Fellows, which brings entrepreneurs from the private sector into a term of residence inside the US government to really think about pushing the envelope when it comes to innovation. Harlow had described the group called 18F that she had worked with on building some tools. 18F was actually created out of the first cohort of Presidential Innovation Fellows who really said we need a top of the line digital agency within US government that can really build 21st century solutions that are open source, transparent, and inaccessible for all agencies to really effectively build out digital tools. During my time as a PIF and shortly after, I was asked to serve as the Chief Technology Officer of two teams, both administratively based at the Department of Homeland Security, focused on homegrown extremism, election security, and online disinformation. And there were a number of grants that we had given out to different implementers at the local level. We also worked with a number of other government agencies. And so I kind of wanted to start off this conversation by sharing just some 5 basic misconceptions about building, deploying, and working with US government and recommendations that we can take moving forward. So the first big misconception that most people have when it comes to grant making is that the funding will be fast. And this is absolutely not true. Most groups that apply for funding, they are looking at staffing up on different developers and staff to actually deploy different tools they've committed to. But oftentimes the procurement process is a lot more difficult than what most program teams anticipate. And so, for example, in our instance, our grant program was delayed by almost a year. And we had nonprofits and local groups that were dependent on us for funding that unfortunately weren't able to get it at a much later point in time. So this creates a really big challenge in that if there are front of the line groups that are working on very time pressing challenges, it becomes really hard for them to depend on the US government for that main source of funding. This is also the reason why it's very difficult for a lot of Silicon Valley startups to actually build more solutions in this space. They are so new, they cannot depend on the longer term procurement timeline for when funding will land. So one of the big recommendations moving forward is really allowing for faster deployment of contracts that can be given out in quicker spurts, in quicker intervals to different teams that are building solutions and tools. The second big misconception is that government agencies actually coordinate with each other when it comes to deploying and funding tools. And the second part is, of course, around internet freedom, that governments, obviously, especially in the US, agencies should obviously have the right contacts at social media companies. This is absolutely not true. There are still to this day many silos. In my experience working with agencies around tools that were very similar that we were all trying to build, and a set of tools that are often funded, a lot of beltway bandits, a lot of contractors that are very familiar in working with agencies, they'll end up just relabeling and retooling existing solutions they built for other agencies, and trying to resell it in to really monetize. And this often leads, a lot of more marginalized groups and those that are really working frontline to really miss out on being able to participate. Government agencies that I've worked with, from the Global Engagement Center to State Department, it's also very hard to discuss what's working and what's not. So if one agency has spent, for example, 1 year trying to deploy a tool that was very hard to do, it is very hard for those best practices to be shared, because nobody wants to discuss failure. And when something fails, it might impact the ability for that particular program team to be able to get funding for that next year. So it's incredibly hard for this coordination to be taken place in a transparent way. But it is something that is so important for, for funding moving forward, for us to have this dialogue, because at the end of the day, it is American taxpayer dollars that are suffering when we experiment in a way that is non-efficient. And when the same government agencies are funding the same exact tools and not coordinating necessarily with each other. So one of the great things over the last few years is there's been increased coordination of actually accessing tools that have a blanket contract among many different agencies, so that nobody has to go through and procure the same tools again and again. So that has been a positive shift. The third point I wanted to make is that not only is it hard to coordinate, but it's easy to deploy the latest digital tools across government teams. This is absolutely not the case. A lot of the other panelists earlier have talked about the use of emerging technologies, from blockchain to Tor and other kinds of decentralized applications. Unfortunately, today, there's a lot of challenges with government agencies feeling comfortable still with what is funded and how it's funded and how user information is collected. A lot of privacy officers today are not necessarily as familiar with product development. And so it becomes really hard for a lot of teams to be able to move forward with authority to operate, even when that tool is built. And this is something that was especially challenging for me when we were trying to deploy a number of tools that we had spent a lot of time working with developers to build over the course of a year. There was a lot of concern that came from our privacy team at different agencies that mentioned, not quite understanding how user data is collected. At the end of the day, this leads to solutions where a lot of the main key features that are meant to actually allow for progression of freedom, internet freedom issues, those key features are often turned off, and it becomes very hard for implementation partners to actually use the solutions. The fourth misconception is that funded tools are tested and evaluated. Most people expect a very strong and rigorous evaluation program. Unfortunately, this is quite hard to do. It's very easy for many people to report success when existing solutions are not there in the first place. The other thing that's very difficult around testing and evaluation is actually the anticipated long-term cost of maintenance. And Mallory had talked about this as well earlier, but there are a lot of hidden costs when it comes to maintaining existing software. And this often leads a lot of tools that may have already been spent millions of dollars in funding not to be maintained after a year, despite the existing R&D that goes into it. And so it is really important as we move forward with grant making strategy to not only have short-term, but a long-term strategy around solutions that are built, especially those that are custom solutions, where it needs a lot more maintenance than what could be anticipated before. The last misconception is that typically in most grant processes, there is a diverse pipeline of grantees. Unfortunately, this is not the case. A lot of grants are put out very last minute in a black box, where a lot of grant program officers are sharing it among an existing network of implementers they already know. This makes it really hard for those that are doing the most impactful work to really keep up, especially those that are resource strapped already. And so one of the things that is really important is for those in the Biden administration to really think about ways to really have a number of events to include an active and diverse participation of those that know how to apply, to ensure that there is a process that allows for more larger and longer term contracting firms, the Beltway bandits, to be able to have a backseat at the time, so that the more underdeveloped voices who may not necessarily have the best in grant in actually applying for the grant application process, which might be rigorous and might be several months long, for those to be able to have an equal footing at the table. The other big challenge around creating a diverse pipeline of grantees is actually language and localization barriers. This is especially challenging because language is often very hard to tools for thinking about how to increase access among global regions, especially, are incredibly hard to translate properly. And so again, this is something that is so important to think about, is how do we ensure that there's not only diversity in the grantee pipeline, but also thinking about localization in languages all around the world. So with that, I wanted to turn it back to Eric.
Great, thanks very much. Good advice. I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done between new technology and kind of risk taking to stimulate innovation. In addition to the major circumvention platforms that have a lot of running costs and complexity, and are delivering results to tens of millions of people every day. So to round out our discussion, I'd like to turn the floor over to Sarah Macon. And I'd like to know a little bit more about aggregating priorities in strategy. Where does that fit in the overall foreign policy and national security context? What needs to be done to better focus these issues at a high level of policy and make sure that those equities are represented?
Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be part of a panel with such sincere, can you hear me, by the way? Did I unmute myself? Okay. With such sincere and truly eloquent voices who have such expertise, including my friend Mung here. I appreciate that you asked me to participate today. I'm just going to give really a brief perspective given my time at the National Security Council. I do think it's important that we see internet freedom as a value, a human right, as well as a commodity. We don't need to look much further than what happened just this past week with the Clubhouse app in China, and then the subsequent and almost immediate blocking of the app by the CCP, to see that there's little doubt that oppressed, persecuted, and exploited people around the world rely on access to innovative digital platforms to break through the censorship that is imposed on them so often by their own governments. And they need those platforms to connect with others. I think we all have a right to that genuine human connection. And that's what often helps, whether it's China, Iran, Belarus, wherever it might be, that's what gives these oppressed people the opportunity to share their stories. I saw a powerful video very recently of a Holocaust survivor. She was talking about the phrase "never again," And she found the phrase somewhat, empty because regimes around the world have continued to commit atrocities against vulnerable people, really ever since those concentration camps closed. Specifically, she was referring to what's taking place today in Xinjiang. And we know that the CCP is exploiting technological means, among many other means, to violate the basic human rights of Uyghurs, including facial recognition software and technology and tracking software. We know that authoritarian and totalitarian regimes will always find ways to violate human rights of vulnerable people. Tech is just one tool they use to do it. So looking at a broader strategy for the USG, part of any US government strategy for addressing human rights violations in the tech space should consider how we counter malign actors, and keeping in mind that we should always maintain the moral high ground of accountability and freedom for all people everywhere. And then I think viewing internet freedom as a commodity would allow USG officials, as well as private sector entities and advocates like many here on this panel, to, on behalf of internet freedom, to include this as part of negotiations with foreign governments and encourage them to release their control in many ways, and try to explain the benefits of doing so. I would hope that that would in the future lead to more progress. So I think seeing it as both a human right and a value, as well as a commodity, is important, in building that into the way that the USG sees it and handles it as an issue. I think in general, we would benefit from a larger strategy, though, than what we have employed in the past. And that was something that we began working on in 2020 when I served at the National Security Council. Listening to Clara, I don't want to repeat so much. She said she went through so eloquently. And so I really just want to associate myself with all of her comments earlier about the dynamics around both the grant making process, the challenges associated with increased coordination of the interagency, and the barriers that she identified. I mean, she listed them. I couldn't have done that any better if I had tried, including the Beltway Bandits issue, right? So those were all things that we saw, and all things that came up as we tried to go through and make a strategy that really worked and would work quickly. Nothing worked quickly. It is the U.S. government. But I'd still, recommend just some general suggestions on mechanisms to kind of get the progress and the process moving. I mean, the USG needs we need to find a way to work with tech platforms that can provide rapid order of magnitude increases. And, I think to Clara's point, if there is a challenge in how we monitor that or count that, then we need to find a way to do it, because we need to be funding circumvention tools that work and implement an intentional funding model that responds in real time to the demonstrated successes of the tech, and can address some of the concerns that she also eloquently laid out. Because we have to be responsive to the American taxpayer, and I think there's a way to deploy a centralized USG strategy that doesn't impede or sacrifice progress in innovation. There's no reason for the USG to guide R&D. It shouldn't be involved in that space. It should instead just provide resources for scaling up in areas where the success has been demonstrated. That's my opinion, but if we can find a way to demonstrate that success, I think that's where the USG can play its best role. And so I would just close with words, what I think are wise words of someone I once worked for. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And I am grateful for the folks on this panel who provide that vigilance in this policy area. Count on you guys to keep it up. So thank you for having me today. I appreciate it very much.
Hey, thank you, Sarah. That was a great summary. In our remaining time, I'd like to turn the program over to my colleague, Aram Sinnreich, who will lead the Q&A. Aram, we have a few questions that have been stacked up, in the Q&A from our audience, which is fine, but it's up to you as to how you want to proceed. So take it away, my friend.
Thank you, Eric. I think I want to start with an issue, a word that came up a lot in your introductory remarks was the word trust, right? And ultimately, technology only works as part of a larger social system, a political system, a cultural system, an institutional system. And all of those systems run on the presumption of trust between the individuals and the institutions who are participating in them. Now, a lot has changed since the heady days a decade ago when internet freedom became a central element of American foreign policy. We've seen the Snowden revelations. We've seen the Trump administration basically dismantling a lot of what the Obama administration had done. We've seen the so-called techlash, where consumers in the US and around the world have become increasingly skeptical of the motivations of both big tech and tech startups in getting into this space. So I guess my opening salvo for you guys is, how does the growing empirically observable trust gap impact abilities to deploy and build investment and adoption of internet freedom platforms? Maybe Harlow, since you're on the ground working with journalists, you can start off with this one.
Sure. Well, first off, from like a personal perspective, in the trainings and the consultings that I have done and continue to do, I would say that it's imperative to be upfront about the limitations of any of these projects, no matter where they come from, no matter how they're funded. Also, I will say that historically, people in the internet freedom and circumvention technology space have been historically very skeptical about technologies that are closed source, technologies that are enterprise level, but we're starting to come to a little bit of a medium ground where we figure we can do a lot more good by teaching people how to use these things appropriately and as safely as possible, rather than just shunting everybody off with the axiom use signal, use Tor, although use signal, use Tor. Another thing that I would say, as far as trust is concerned, has to do with the process that we've built around the tool building. It's not just the fact that you have a GitHub repository where people can audit the code, but you also have open discussions about things like reproducible builds, so you know exactly how these services are managed, the relationship between these services and inevitably the big consumer players that you're going to have to contend with, such as hosting on Amazon, how you treat your buckets on AWS as far as user data is concerned, how you are planning on the inevitable day when you have to answer requests from law enforcement. Not only that, actually, Clara mentioned things like internationalization and other community tools. Over the very short course of this community building, the internet freedom space has invested heavily, not only in the tool building, but also these I guess you would say auxiliary tools like Localization Lab, Simply Secure, and other projects that actually make sure that things are properly internationalized so people can read them in their languages, have UX properties that are accessible to people from a varying scale, so it doesn't end up to be just another crypto nerd project that nobody's going to use that wastes taxpayers' money. So that effort is actually there, and seeing that happen in the open and also inviting communities internationally to participate in that goes a very, very long way. And actually, I could even go into the weeds to talk about the ways that we've had to work and look inward to root out toxicity within the community, to make it more accessible, to hold space for people to have conversations and to feel safe asking questions. All of those things, yeah, sometimes some of those projects are funded by taxpayer money, but we would not have been where, or we would not have gotten to where we are right now without those things. And no one should forget the importance of those things.
So that's a great starting point. And I'm thinking about, the people who are not technologists, the people who are on the ground in Myanmar, or, in the People's Republic of China or in Iran, who are trying to just develop communities and political movements in relative safety and privacy. How is it possible to communicate trust to those communities when the US government, at the same time as it's investing in these platforms, is also promoting, as Mallory mentioned, like anti-encryption legislation like the EARN IT Act, is also engaging in hacks, from Stuxnet on. Right now, the fact that the entire US government has essentially been hacked through SolarWind and all the associated stuff that we're still learning about. How is it possible to communicate the degree of trust necessary to get those most vulnerable communities to invest in the most useful tools in the midst of this this kind of fog of mistrust that has come to pervade the use of technology?
Aram, if I may take the crack at that important question. I think a particular tool, FreeGate, was mentioned early on, and it is immensely popular and very highly used. And I think it helps to look at the success cases of those tools that have proven to have a high adoption rate in certain key demographics and regions. And I'll encourage everybody to take a look at the video from part 1 of this conversation, where multiple providers of these tools talked about their experience. And I think if you look at FreeGate and the like, they distribute and encourage usage in part based on the social fabric of trust. That's one reason why they have a very high adoption rate. And by the way, with a lot of the benefits to different various definitions of open source, one could also argue whether a tool like FreeGate, is that open source according to all definitions? Probably not, but that's all right. It turns out they are perhaps the most heavily used. Now, I guess adoption is ultimately the only key fundamental metric, and they're very high on that metric. We can all learn a lot from how these proven adoption successes have worked. And I know that there was a chart shown earlier, 6 different areas, categories of funding, one of which is service. And while it's not as glamorous as fundamental research, perhaps, it actually points to the direction of capacity building. And often the limitation is on the capacity that can be provided to the successful tools already working out there. And there are still a lot of wonderful research. By the way, I would encourage also folks to take a look at research done by teams at, say, Chicago, Nick Feimster at Princeton, my former colleagues, Jennifer Rexford and Pratik Mittal, outstanding fundamental research. And I think is not mutually exclusive to also look at trust-based adoption of many of those research in a variety of forms and shapes. Over.
I'm not the moderator, and also I definitely do appreciate that researchers publish their white papers and stake their claims. I mean, that is absolutely fundamental. But there is a little bit of a tautology involved in saying that it's trusted because it's so widely used.
Would you mind elaborating?
It's a tautology. It's trusted because it's widely used doesn't necessarily mean that something is trustworthy.
So
right. Let me maybe I can try to help address that from my biased angle here. One is that because of the trust in the social fabric that the founders and operators of these tools have on the ground understanding of what's going on in a particular country, let's say. And therefore, the way that these tools are distributed and used rely upon that social trust. So trust is an enabler of wide adoption. Secondly, the fact that it's so widely used and yet people are still using it, I think is also another continuous verification. It's like an audit, except it's audit by actual usage of people's ability to say, you know what, even though this is high on the list, still I dare to use it. And their ability, their daring to use it, I think is also one way to prove that there is the trust needed for this to continue to work. So I wouldn't say it's tautological. I would say trust helps enable adoption, and the continued success of adoption is a continuous verification of trust.
Mallory, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add that I think we are underestimating how much privacy protecting and censorship resistant tools are in use, because from a technological perspective, they're very much the same. I mean, if you can't see someone's activity over the network, it's really hard to block what they're doing or what they're looking at. And then also there's the added benefit that it is generally really secure for end users. And that is the way that the industry, the larger tech industry, has moved. So as we see end-to-end encryption, for example, in more and more messaging apps, we're getting signal on a mass scale because it's in WhatsApp, it's in Facebook Messenger, iMessage, Android messages, and that's because, talking about, supply and demand side, the business model has changed. Privacy is now the business model for a lot of tech companies. And we're seeing that is shifting, it's not yet widespread, but we see companies like Apple and Mozilla for sure, some smaller sort of underlying service providers that we don't really see very much. I see them in the technical community. And I think that that's a really important leverage point, that, it's building trust with users and actually being sold a product that is trustworthy and that protects their privacy. And that's part of what people are choosing to use, or why they're choosing to use it. And I think that can sometimes be undermined actually by governments, and has been undermined by the US in the past, really set internet freedom back over the last 10 years with the Snowden revelations and other things. And, to go back again and talk again about the, anti-encryption legislation, these are different parts of the government undermining one another. It is, an economic disaster to disrupt encryption. It is not helpful to to sow fear, uncertainty, and distrust about, different parts of the internet in elections, for example, and, dealing with objectionable content. There needs to be a little bit more coordination around that in the government and to make sure that we are fostering trust. That's really critical. And it's been mentioned multiple times. And I agree that it's a really important element of this.
Clara, did you have your hand up?
I did. I wanted to just jump in and say, big misconception, because I had worked in both the Obama and Trump administration, is that politicals play a large role. In fact, most grant programs are run by career government employees that have been there for a really long time. And the trust that they build with organizations over time is so critical, because I was part of a grant program where we actually had grantees that were funded and committed funding during the Obama administration that, because of symbolic representation under Trump, decided to reject funding that was given. And that just caused a lot of backwards movement in being able to have future grants for these kinds of purposes. My team was really focused on countering white homegrown extremism and obviously white supremacy in the US, and a lot of the symbolic movement of who is in power sometimes is counterintuitive to that. But just remembering that, at the end of the day, for also groups to remember that a lot of government programs are run by civil servants that are there to serve every single day, who really truly care about the problem at hand. They are the ones working the front lines, spending a lot of time with communities, really on the ground. And moving forward, that still needs to continue. Really having those people continue to have open dialogues of convening and talking and listening to the problem, so that again, when we have more innovative tool makers and startups come into the table, they're not building in the dark either, that are so far away from the actual on the ground user needs. We've heard a lot earlier around a number of voices and groups that may not necessarily be as resourced with the latest in technological innovation, how we can do better pairing to make sure that those groups are talking with each other rather than staying in silos. And so I think all of that needs to continue. There have been accelerators that have been set up inside US government that really try to pair this innovation together, so that, and you know, during my time, I created a digital marketing academy to really help more marginalized voices that were not as digitally literate be able to really figure out how to measure and evaluate their programs in the online space. So you know, those really need to continue. It's also important that to remember that not everyone is that digitally illiterate. Some of the most important voices are not online, and how we can really make sure that we can carry those voices online as well.
Thank you. Those are great points. In the interest of time, I'd like to get to what I think is a really important question from one of our audience members who's based in Russia. And they're asking about the flip side of the coin, right? The cost of having a truly open platform with very few controls over communication and content is that malicious actors can take advantage of those platforms to flood them with disinformation, with abusive and toxic speech, with botnets and the kinds of messaging that can go through them that effectively turn into a kind of cultural denial of service attack, just overwhelming the public sphere with so much disinformation that truthful information can't cut through. How do you guys envision a best practices balance between an optimally open internet freedom platform and some kind of resilience against bad actors and disinformation? Maziar, you've been silent so far. Maybe you can lead off with that one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and because the situation in Russia is very similar to Iran, I may be able to answer that. I think internet freedom on its own, when we talk about internet freedom, is just one side of the coin. And it's like, if we talk about better highways and expressway, but if we don't have any traffic laws or we don't have good cars that can, you know, travel in these good expressways or highways. I think at the same time that we're talking about internet freedom, we have to think about the rules and regulations of how internet freedom can work. Freedom can work, and also talk about the media outlets that operate within this free atmosphere. Because if people do not have any reliable sources that they can go to in order to receive information, there will be chaos, and at the same time, bad actors can infiltrate. And also technology companies, big technology companies, they are responsible for monitoring the activities of what's going on in their sites. And, you know, I read this New York Times article about this Canadian woman who was going around and destroying the reputation of her former employers, which is horrible, because as a human rights activist, I'm used to being criticized and I'm used to being public, and, you know, people insult me on a regular basis, and, you know, I have death threats on a daily basis, but it doesn't really bother me. But when ordinary people are subjected to such hatred and to such venom, that is the responsibility of technology companies that, you know, that they have to accept. So I think while governments should definitely invest in internet freedom, they also have to think about global legislations for internet companies, for multinational internet companies. And at the same time, they have to invest in local and meaning inside the United States, but at the same time, media outlets, reliable media outlets outside of the US and other countries as well, in order for people to be able to go to a reliable source to get the information. Otherwise, there will be chaos, and bad actors love nothing better than chaos.
Truer words were never spoken. Anyone else have a final parting shot before I kick things back to Eric? Harlow, go ahead.
Actually, I would be very curious to kick it off to Sarah, who had mentioned that there is, like the possibility of things being a human right and also a commodity. And so that would be my question, and I would love to discuss more about that.
I think I'm back off mute. When I call it a commodity, I think my perspective there is just to make sure that it is included in, what I saw as negotiations from between us and other countries, right? And so you guys are clearly experts on this topic, right? I covered so many other things for many years, but when I saw this as something that was not always addressed or considered as a priority, I tried to figure out why that might be, right? And when it was put in a box as just a human right or as just something else, I saw that it would kind of fall to the wayside. And so one of the ways I started to look at it is how do we get it the attention that maybe it deserves? And if it's considered as a commodity, maybe then, USTR and others would then see it as an important and valuable asset or tool that they can use in negotiations. And whether it be USG officials or private sector entities or advocates like yourselves, or for that matter, business owners, being able to use it as they discuss with either foreign governments or counterparts in other countries and discuss why it's something that shouldn't be either taken for granted or taken advantage of or blocked. Maybe an opportunity for us to make progress, but certainly open to pushback on that. But that's how I saw it, is trying to at least open it up so that it wasn't just put in a box somewhere, and then only DRL at state could fund it, or only these other smaller entities had an opportunity to find ways to make progress for some of these platforms or technologies. We were always trying to come up with ways to kind of expand the network even within the USG to address the issue. I don't know if that answers the question, Harlow, but.
I think it starts to, as always with these events, I feel like we're just beginning to scratch the surface when we get to the end of our time. So I wish we had another hour to kick it around, but I've got to send things back to Eric to close out the show.
Great, very good. Thanks, Aram. Great job, and great job, panelists. Please join me in thanking them for these excellent remarks. I hope that we've been able to expose some of the issues of the day, that we've been able to look at priorities and policies and all of the components that our panelists have been able to uncover. But a lot of work remains to be done, as Aram says. We've only just scratched the surface here. And I think it's up to the community and our 100 plus participants in this panel today to keep their eye on the Biden administration, and let's get transparency and all these other values that we hold so dear to come into play, so that we have a vibrant dialogue, that we have government accountability, and that we are taking advantage in using the rather modest resources that we have to the greatest value that we can possibly do. So with that, we are right on time. Thanks again, everyone. And I'm sorry that we were not able to answer all questions, but we have run out the clock. And it's been a very pleasurable afternoon for me and my colleagues at American University. Thanks to Matt, Chelsea, and Kate Arian for putting this together. They did an absolutely super job at keeping us all online. And I wish you goodbye and good health.